Listen up. We're at lecture number 12, environmental ethics. Before we get started, there are two issues. For team formation, if you don't have a team yet, please come down here to the front after class, because I believe there's more than one person who doesn't have a team. You can form up a team and be set for that. Second thing, Veronica compiled the average of the response from the last attendance question. That was, do you think that if you commit academic misconduct, cheat on tasks, whatever, that you're likely to have unprofessional or unethical behavior in the workplace? And the average from the class was 0.81. That was a number between 0 and 1. 1 being more likely that it would happen. And that's not surprising that you'd have that response. Today, we're doing a switch in subjects a bit away from the workplace, like the last few lectures have covered. We're going into environmental ethics. So in environmental ethics, there are a number of issues that arise. This is a large and growing area, such as the area of environmental engineering, Department of Civil Engineering, but it's relevant to every discipline in engineering. Because you people are going to be developing new technologies for many years, and if your technology messes up the environment, it can affect the health of awful high number of humans, so that would be considered very bad. In fact, engineering has been blamed in the past for creating a good portion of the mess that we're in right now. And so there's a growing emphasis in this field in engineering in basically two ways: to understand the environment, number one, and number two, to understand the impact of environmental concerns on design of technology. That's the so-called sustainable design. And we'll talk about both those issues today. So in particular, we're going to set this in the context of ethics. So this is a study of moral issues concerning environment and morals, perspectives, beliefs, and attitudes. There are a lot of different attitudes about the environment out there. Some people couldn't care less about the environment. Some people will dedicate their life to trying to make sure that there are fewer and fewer problems caused by humans in having an adverse impact on the environment. In fact, there's a sizable contingent of people who believe that humans have no adverse impact on the environment. Okay, so it's somewhat of a messy field at this point in time. But let's go back and cover some principles. Adam Smith, really the father of modern economics, has had this idea of the invisible hand in his Wealth of Nations. Okay, this idea of the invisible hand goes like this. It says that business persons think only of their self-interest. In other words, they want to make lots of money and do well. Okay, and then he said, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, and the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own interest. Okay, he says the butcher, the brewer, and the baker are selling you a meal, and making sure whoever can get it to you on time, a good meal or a good drink, whatever, you're going to get they're going to get your business, they're going to prosper. Okay, so he says that it's a system of greed, essentially, that results in good things. Okay, and this is really a very basic view of capitalism. Then he says, yet although he tends only to his own gain, he's led by an invisible hand to promote an end which has no part of his intention. Okay, regular supply of meals, for instance. So by pursuing his own interests, he frequently promotes that of society more effectually than he really intends to promote it. All right. Now, this philosophy is subscribed to by many people, but others would say there's certain problems with it. So, professionals and many business persons do profess to trade for the public good, claiming a commitment to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. So there is sort of this fundamental problem in engineering ethics. I mean, You know, if you remember one thing from the class, it's either you have moral autonomy, you make your own decisions, stand up for your right to make an ethical decision, or hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. All right? So there's this fundamental tension between sort of greed and holding up paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. And we'll discuss that here. So we might be predominantly motivated by self-interest, but you might have a general moral concern for others. You have a general moral concern to make sure that your braking system, electronic braking system on an automobile, works really well. You have also a genuine interest in getting paid a good salary working for an automotive company. Those are both valid objectives. Companies benefit society in many ways through self-interest. We create companies that produce goods and services for consumers. And that can be good, perhaps not always, but most often it seems it is. Competition drives quality improvements and cost reductions. This is the idea from economists that says the market is efficient. It creates new jobs for employees and suppliers. So the wealth, other people don't like the consumerism that the wealth supports, okay? But it also supports taxes for education and philanthropy. The problem with the invisible hand metaphor that many of us adopt is it doesn't adequately take into account damage to the environment, such as pollution as a byproduct of your greed and making sure you do good for the person that's paying you. You can pollute and not essentially be charged for it, okay? The destruction of natural habitats, the depletion and damage of shared resource. So what we've learned over history is we can't rely on the self-interest of companies in order to protect the environment. They'll pollute like mad because they can, generally speaking, it is cheaper to pollute than not to pollute, okay? And so they can make more profits if they pollute, generally speaking. And that's why we have organizations today like the EPA or like government restrictions on various pollution. Of course, it's very controversial. I understand that. I mean, you know, you start cranking up the regulations on coal-fired power plants and you create a political firestorm. Okay, it all comes down to values, and you know, and your understanding of science, the science that shows how you know, various forms of energy adversely affect the environment. Okay, if you don't believe it's a problem, of course, you don't like any regulation. Connected to this issue is the idea of the tragedy of the commons. So even way back in Aristotle, he observed that we tend to be thoughtless about things we do not own individually, and which seem to be an unlimited supply. This was popularized in the 60s by Hardin in particular, Lloyd and Hardin. The Hardin in particular is called the tragedy of the commons. So the idea is that they gave in their original paper is that if you have some cattle in a common pasture, let's say in the middle of a village, they found that they're more stunted in their growth than those kept on private land. Okay, the common fields were much more worn than the private land. So the individual farmers are motivated by self-interest to enlarge their common pasture herd by 1 or 2 cows. So everybody's putting cows in the middle of the pasture and they say, well, I'm going to put some more there, and but everybody does it, and then it runs down the common area. Okay? When it's their own field, they're going to take care of it a lot better, and make sure it's not overgrazed so they don't run into this problem. Okay? So it's the collective behavior that creates the problem. It seems to each individual reasonable. I'll put one more cow there, and then everybody thinks that way, and before you know it, you've got a mess on your hands. Okay? So competitive. Not necessarily malicious, but unthinking exploitation arises with all natural resources. That's, you know, what if I pollute a little bit? Big deal. It's a big world. What if I pollute the water? What if I pollute the land? What if I pollute the air? The problem is that's a big commons. We're all for at least the foreseeable future, stuck on planet Earth together, right? And so there's been a perspective that each of us can pollute a little bit. The problem is, collectively, it turns into a lot and creates problems with killing off species and affecting the whole biosphere, such as the issue of climate change, which, again, is controversial. Today, there's a wide consensus that we need concerted response to ecological concerns that combine economic realism with ecological awareness. I think that, even if you do not think that humans have had any impact on the environment, I think that there's enough evidence that you ought to be concerned and you ought to be cautious. It simply makes sense to be cautious. I mean, one of the things we have to be as an engineer with our technologies is cautious. It's one of the main lessons from this class. So being cautious in this case means try to produce products that don't pollute. Right? So we play a key role in this whole issue. We are the ones that develop technical details on environmental impact. How much does this chemical impact? How you create an electronic device like an iPhone, how much will it pollute when it's thrown in the trash, etc. We help set policy and help follow the laws, and we help make it economically feasible. Okay, so you pour a lot of effort into doing a design that will impact the environment as little as possible, and at the same time be competitive in the marketplace. You understand how difficult this is because you add this constraint of the environment on, and likely your product costs may go up. Okay, and the question is what do you do about that? You also understand that, well, there's no such thing as a technology that doesn't pollute. I mean, I don't know if anybody can name one. I mean, everything pollutes, right? In a certain sense. I mean, well, I certainly pollute. Okay, everybody pollutes. I mean, the question is how much? Okay, how much can we minimize that pollution? So, the idea in engineering is also often called sustainable development. So historically, engineers were not as responsible concerning the environment as they should have been, and that really reflected the attitudes in society. I'm talking 100 years ago, okay? So individual engineers differ considerably in their views. Some have a larger holistic view, some do not. Some are heavily driven in their attitudes by their political party affiliation. I mean, if the Democrats believe that climate change is a problem, I believe it because I'm a Democrat, or vice versa, something like that. It's amazing the extent to which a political party affects a personal view. No rationality whatsoever, okay? We can have a fun discussion after class on this, but it's pretty amazing because it seems that with some people it has a stronger influence than religion or anything else. Political party drives a lot, okay? And that's complicated because you really don't want such drivers because that's not science. That's not got anything to do with careful engineering. You want to be able to forget about all that stuff and do the right thing by your product, the environment, the people you're serving, okay? And that can be very difficult. So I think it's important just to think about it, honestly, because just think carefully about the whole issue. You want to try to integrate your understanding of environment into your personal design process, team design process. You may sit in the conference room and be concerned that you're designing a product with a team of engineers, and you may say, I'm just a little concerned. This product's going to pollute a lot, and see how people react. I mean, if you may not know whether it matters or not, but it may warrant further study. So just having concern is certainly valid. How does this environment thing reflected in the codes of ethics? So it's throughout all the codes these days. In 1997, ASCE put it in theirs. They say engineers should hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Standard statement. and shall strive to comply with the principles of sustainable development in their performance of their professional duties. They also have a requirement to notify proper authorities when principles of sustainable development are violated by anyone. In the IEEE Code of Ethics, it says at the beginning of number 1, and to disclose properly factors that might endanger the public or the environment. I find it's somewhat weak. I wish they would have put in something about design for environment, in other words, design to avoid problems with the environment. And they don't really integrate the whole idea of sustainable development, which is through many codes. As you might suspect, I think the IEEE Code of Ethics needs a lot of work, needs an update. So, what is sustainable development? Our Common Future report from the UN on 1997 defined sustainable development, and this definition has stood. Most people use it. It is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So the way to think of it is we do technology design for us. Will the same technologies or better ones be able to be present for our grandchildren or great-grandchildren? You can think of it that way if you want. There's many other views on sustainability. There's concern about this word needs and whether it should be the central focus. So there's this person, Solo, that defines sustainability as a requirement that the next generation must be left with whatever it takes to achieve a standard of living at least as good as our own, and to look out for the next generation similarly. But there's always this recursiveness to the definition. It basically says, don't screw it up so much in our generation that they can't have a good life in the next generation, and so on and so on. Okay, that's the basic idea. Amartya Sen, in his book, The Idea of Justice, says we need to sustain and when possible expand freedoms, including freedoms to meet our needs, live our life according to certain standards and capabilities, and what humans value and have reason to think are important without compromising those in future generations. So there's all these little permutations on the perspective of what sustainability means. So ASCE has one. ASCE, out of the engineering organizations, has thought about this whole issue a lot more carefully, probably because they're concerned with things like water, sanitation, and buildings. One of the biggest polluters in the United States is tearing down old buildings and throwing them in the dump, right? So they've thought about this issue a lot. So they say sustainable development is a process of change in which the direction of investment, orientation of the technology, and allocation of resources, and the development and functioning of institutions is directed to meet present needs and aspirations without endangering the capacity of natural systems to absorb the effects of human activities. So there's a certain, if you study the environment has a certain ability to absorb pollution of various types. But what we're doing, unfortunately, is we're providing pollution at a greater rate than apparently the scientists say than what it can absorb. And without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs and aspirations. So, each person can do something. What each person does or does not do matters, okay? But also, what corporations do or don't do matters. They need to provide leadership on this. So, often, these days, it's good business for a corporation to be perceived by the public as environmentally responsible. There are many people that are green. They want the products they buy not to pollute. They don't want their corporations they're buying from polluting. And they'll spend a little extra money even on products in this case. A good example from quite a few years ago of a company that really led the way on this design for environment ideas, Compaq Computer. I don't know if any of you remember them, but they merged into Hewlett-Packard. Right? When computers were personal computers were first invented, they had products, okay, and people liked them. They're popular products, but it sort of went away. They got swallowed up, etc. So they had the so-called life cycle strategy. So they used resources efficiently in making the computers. They had energy efficient products. They made them so they're easy to disassemble, thinking ahead for recycling, and they try to minimize the waste. They like to minimize the number of things that would just be thrown in the landfill. Now, the government has a role here too. technology assessment. So the laws and regulations are a lightning rod in environmental controversies. Everybody knows that. It's clear that all these environmental laws are heavily controversial, at least in this country. But we need laws to protect the great degradation of the commons. There's really, it seems, no other way to go about it than that. We've tried it for hundreds of years and it wasn't working without that. But how much law, and what sort, and to what ends, are matters of continual disagreement. And it's not just having a law. A law means essentially nothing if it's not enforced. And enforcement typically costs money. So what the United States has been passed that's had really some of these really big impacts was the National Environmental Policy Act in '69, Occupational Safety and Health Act in '70, Clean Air Act in '70, Clean Water Act in '72, Toxic Substance Control Act in '76. I mean, these have had big impacts. I was born in '61, and so I was growing up while this stuff was happening. It was sort of in my periphery, but I think if you look back at history, it's astounding because we had some incredibly polluted areas in the United States that were cleaned up as a result of these things. They've had an incredible impact. You know, the people still talk. I don't know if you remember how polluted Lake Erie was, for instance. Okay, it was a huge problem. Okay, when you go to other countries, it's shocking sometimes. At least in some countries. 2 summers ago, I was in El Salvador, and they have a big lake out in the middle of the country. It is unbelievably polluted. It's accessible. I mean, it's horrendous. And they have laws against it, but they're not enforced because it's the big corporations that are doing the pollution. Okay, including a few U.S. companies. I was told there, like Monsanto and Coca-Cola, are dumping. So we do these laws here. We keep this clean. The United States, we're keeping the laws apply here, but those laws don't apply to companies elsewhere in other countries. And a lot of times those countries don't have the power to act. So these were controversial acts back when they were passed, but these are the kinds of examples of what it means to protect the commons. Okay. So next, connected to all of this is the issue of how to prevent natural disasters. So communities at state and local levels have special responsibility to conserve natural resources and beauty for future generations. State of Ohio has Ohio Department of Natural Resources, maintains the state parks, tries to maintain, every state has that sort of thing, okay, to try to protect the environment. They also have a responsibility to prevent hurricanes, floods, fires, earthquakes from becoming disasters. So they put various restrictions on human habitat, saying where homes can and cannot be built, etc. And they try to strengthen lifelines for essential utilities such as water and electricity in case of a disaster. Try to put in defensive structures like dams, dikes, breakwaters, avalanche barriers. These are the kind of things that our state tax dollars go towards. Okay. Try to assure safe exits in the form of roads and passages designed as escape routes. There's people sitting around thinking about this and working on it every day in every state in the United States. Emergency shelters, emergency warning systems. You hear them around Columbus. Adequate clinical facilities for medical help. Agreements with neighboring communities for sharing resources in emergencies. There's people that are working on this all the time to make sure that we can respond appropriately to emergencies. So, when you talk to ecologists, in my experience, there's tree huggers, okay, but then there's people. A lot of the people that are very concerned about the environment are sort of very pragmatic. It's pretty enlightening to talk to them about how they think the problem should be solved. And one of the issues they often rise is this market mechanisms and the internalizing cost. So usually when you're putting out a technological product, you include direct costs of labor, raw materials, and use of facilities. But the true cost should include effects of pollution, depletion of energy and raw materials, and disposal. The problem, that might be true, okay, because then what you're going to do is our products then would reflect, trying to get money in order to pay for cleanup and keeping the environment good for everyone else. The problem is that enforcement of that would be extremely difficult, right? I mean, think, how would you make sure that someone would you'd have to raise taxes, like an environmental tax on every product. How else could you do it? People would scream. So taxpayers are revolting against higher levies all the time, like levies on education. This happens in the Columbus area all the time. We have a levy for education and it's defeated, okay? So the method of having the user of a particular product or service pay for all of its cost is gaining favor. The problem is that's a little bit of an optimistic statement, because it would essentially come down to a tax, and at least in the current political environment, I doubt that would happen. I'm just going to mention these few people. If you want to read about some people that have been very active in these areas, of course, the classic person is Rachel Carson. She argued successfully about problems with DDT, and Sherwood Rowland, who identified the problem with depletion of the ozone layer with chlorofluorocarbons, there's a lot of people that are current activists too. So human-centered ethics. This focuses on the benefits of the natural environment to humans and threats to human beings presented by the destruction of nature. In other words, when you look at the problem of environment and design for environment, you say, I will try to avoid anything that damages the environment in the sense that it would be a damage that would hurt humans. All right, some people have that perspective. Okay, so that essentially assumes that of everything living on Earth, human beings have the only inherent moral worth. So we're going to start getting to religion here, okay? Because you got to ask yourself the question about the value of the rest of nature. Okay, that's often coming from a religion. So utilitarianism says maximize good consequences for human beings. All right. There might be concern that many products are made from natural resources. There might be aesthetic interest, such as the beauty of plants, waterfalls, and mountain ranges. So they may be, from a human perspective, have value, and therefore you wouldn't destroy them because humans would not like that. There's recreational interests, such as hiking and backpacking. Okay. There's scientific interest in the study of ecological preserves, like rainforest. There's survival interest to conserve resources and preserve the natural environment. So there's all these human interests. Okay, so and you can't forget that. I mean, why do you care about the waterfall and the lake, and et cetera? Because they're used for many different reasons. People value them. Humans value them for many different reasons. Now, from a rights ethics perspective, this argues that the basic rights to life and to liberty entail a right to a livable environment. So each person has this right because they're a human, and because a livable environment is essential for one to fulfill his human capacities. And given the danger to our environment today, and hence the danger to the very possibility of human existence, access to a livable environment must be conceived as a right which imposes upon everyone the correlative moral obligation. Virtue ethics. So virtue ethics, like we had discussed earlier in class, focuses on being prudent, humble, have an appreciation of beauty, gratitude towards the natural world that makes life possible, and a stewardship over resources that are needed for future generation. So they may have the perspective that not everything of importance within human-centered ethics fits neatly into a cost-benefit analyses that we do in engineering with limited time horizons. So much must be accounted for by constraints or limits that cannot be assigned dollar signs. It's hard to value parts of the environment. Now, there's other forms of ethics. Some of you may have this sort of perspective yourself, this sentient-centered ethics. So it recognizes all sentient animals as having inherent worth. Also, a sentient animal is one that feels pain and pleasure and has desires. Some utilitarians extend their theory that right action maximizes goodness for all affected to sentient animals as well as humans. One of the persons in this context is Peter Singer, who's still alive today and is still writing heavily, feels that ignoring sentient animals amounts to discrimination. So he says that he calls it speciesism. You know, if you're killing animals indiscriminately, you're committing a type of discrimination, he would say. There's biocentric ethics. That's life-centered ethics, regards all living organisms having inherent worth. So this is the so-called bioempathy. That's our capacity to experience kinship with other life, to experience other life in its struggle to survive and grow. So he spoke of a reverence for life as a fundamental excellence of character. Now so there's a spectrum of these different perspectives, and each of you are going to lie somewhere in different in their perspective. I mean, some of these kinds of ethics may be hard for people to understand and align with, and that's fine. I think you have to just decide where you align. So another person connected to this biocentric ethics is that, or says, Paul Taylor says that there's 4 duties. That we have a duty not to kill other living things. That's problematic for me. I mean, I do it every day in the shower when I shower bacteria off myself. Maybe not all of them die when you go down the drain, but non-interference, which is the duty not to interfere with the freedom of living organisms. Fidelity, which is the duty not to violate the trusts of wild animals, such as trapping. Restitution, which is duty to make amends for violating previous duties. Some of these type of ethics arise out of some indigenous cultures sometimes. Next, there's ecocentric ethics. So this locates an inherent value in ecological systems. So rather than individual organisms, the whole system, whole ecosystem. All right, so Leopold says that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong when it tends otherwise. He says, though, this code does not replace or cancel previously socially generated human-oriented duties, such as locating inherent worth in wider ecological systems, does not cancel out or make less important what we owe to human beings. So this person is trying to have a little balance with respect to the ecosystem and humans. Then there's religious perspectives. This is a complicated subject, how religions feel about the environment and faith. But I wanted to bring it up. So the Judeo-Christian tradition, a lot of people go back to Genesis in the Bible, the book of the Bible, and quote, be fruitful and multiply, when God is speaking to man, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. But at the same, so a lot of people go with that sort of statement. In other words, we're at the top, we can do anything we want. And they don't read a little further in Genesis, in the 2nd chapter, says we must have stewardship over all the earth, suggesting a role of a caretaker. So the old view, it seems, is the one of dominion, the 100-year-old view. The new view is more along these lines of the stewardship for the environment. In Islam, the Quran contains passages that alternate between themes of exploitation of nature for human pleasure and themes of responsible stewardship over what ultimately remains the property of God, not humans. So there's some close correspondence then, I think naturally, considering the history of the religions, between the Judeo-Christian tradition and the tradition of Islam. So what people say is that these traditions, and this is a lot of people, I mean, there are 1.9 billion Muslims in the world, 2.1 billion Christians, 14 million Jewish people. That's a large piece of the world. And if you read in their areas, you'll find that they're sort of rethinking their traditions in light of what we learned about the environment. And this is the growing focus for sure, is the stewardship focus. In Zen Buddhism, there's a stress of the unity of self with nature. In Taoism, there's accent the themes of unity of nature and the universe. In Hinduism, it promulgates an idea of oneness with nature and a doctrine of ahimsa, nonviolence and non-killing. It also portrays as the sacred and naturalist fused symbolized in the idea of divinities being reincarnated in living creatures. The American Indian, non-human animals have spirits. They are to be killed only out of necessity and then atoned for, and apologies made to the animal spirit. Similar things come in other native cultures. So what you're presented with is a lot of confusion. We've got a whole range of different ethics and concepts to be concerned about. We're concerned about sustainable design. Okay, and each person is going to be different in that. If you're on an engineering team, you may have disagreement even on your team and how much you value not polluting. Okay, and you've got to realize that the people on the team, the people in the corporation, are going to be influenced by their own perspectives, their own philosophies, their own religions, etc. So this becomes quite a complicated issue. Okay. So we'll talk about case studies. Just to show you, you're going to be running into this kind of stuff in engineering industry. These are from past students in this class. First student, I was working for a company that adjusted the level of waste dumped into a river. It was the Olentangy River, according to the level of the river. In other words, they would dump excess, well over EPA regulations, amounts of waste into the river after periods of excess rain, or would wait until the river rose so that they could dump more waste again. Okay, and this is, they learn about this issue, and they're an engineer. What do they have to do in such a situation? I mean, if your company's violating EPA rules, you know it, they know it, what's your responsibility? That becomes a really, really difficult issue. I mean, you'd like to think that you could, EPA rules, and this is the law we're talking about being broken. I mean, likely you should feel very uncomfortable in this situation and try to do something about it. It would be very reasonable to start internally, right? And get the problem fixed, all right? You could also think about quitting under protest and turning them in. Next, I used to work for a civil engineer modeling a sewer system. We collected observations from a survey crews. One day a photo came in of a company actively dumping industrial waste chemicals, paint, into a sewer. A note was attached reporting that this is illegal. No one did anything about it. Again, a tough issue, because what would you do? Probably the right thing to do is call the EPA. I mean, it's not, you're not going to go enforce. You're not going to run out and do it yourself. You call the EPA, let them deal with it. Next, I've worked in industry for a while. Employees were dumping, big long chemical name, down the sanitary drain. It's a hazardous material. After discussing this with other employees, we decided to put a stop to this nonsense. So it's interesting, this person saw it was wrong and did something about it internally. Should he or she have called the EPA too? That's a tough one. Depends on the severity of the infraction, etc. So, not clear. Next, I was employed for one day at Company X, a place where fuels and other chemicals are tested and created. This is a local engineering firm. I was hired as a utility person, cleaning glassware, etc. When faced with disposal of heavy metals, I inquired as to their procedure. They told me to dump it down the drain and don't ask questions. Clearly this is wrong, but I agreed to do it. Again, when 2 quarts of diesel fuel was to be disposed, I asked and got the same response. The next day, I was fired for being an environmentalist. I contacted a relative who has ties with the EPA. Recently, I saw that Company X was fined by the EPA for infractions. Interesting, isn't it? This is a co-op student, right? It's kind of weird. I mean, he went along with it. He dumped heavy metals down the drain, okay? But he kept saying, this is wrong, I'll do it, but this is wrong, And they just threw him out of there. Then he goes back and gets them. I mean, that's a major issue. Take, sick the government on somebody. That person was in this class, and I talked to him afterwards, and he was like, it was sort of, he didn't say he felt bad about what he had done, but he said, you know, it was he said it was a very difficult thing for him, losing the job, and of course it affects him financially, you know, he's trying to, I think if I remember correctly, he was trying to pay for school, state, tuition, etc. But later he got another job and all was fine, and all. I think what you want to do in these situations is be able to look back and feel like you acted with integrity and feel good about what you did. Next, an NSP BER case. Our friend Engineer A is a principal in an environmental engineering firm and is requested by a developer client to prepare an analysis of a piece of property adjacent to a wetlands area for potential development as a residential condominium. During the firm's analysis, one of the engineering firm's biologist reports to Engineer A that is, in his opinion, the condominium project could threaten a bird species that inhabits the adjacent wetlands area. The bird species is not an endangered species, but it is considered a threatened species by federal and state environmental regulators. In subsequent discussions with the developer client, Engineer A verbally mentions the concern, but Engineer A does not include the information in a written report that will be submitted to a public authority that is considering the developer's proposal. So, was it ethical for him or her not to include the information about the threat to a bird species in a written report that will be submitted to public authority? Okay. Now, this is complicated, right? Because the client wants this project to go forward. There's millions of dollars to be made by doing such development. Okay. So there's reasons not to bring such issues up. But at the same time, you know, biologist is a professional. Okay. I mean, now the question is how much does you and your team value the effect on that species, right? And I can tell you that 30 or 40 years, people would say, who cares? These days, you better be careful. Things have changed a lot. There's a lot of people that value, such species and are concerned about that. In fact, you know, what I would say is your generation, there's no question, your generation is generally more concerned about the environment than my generation. No question. Okay. You hear comments among students and what they're interested in. They're voting with their feet and joining various majors like environmental engineering or various student clubs and so forth. Okay, we're at the end. We're a little bit early. Everybody's happy. Okay, so if you're listening, define the tragedy of the commons. Okay? Write out in several sentences if you need to be. Put your name on the sheet and hand it to Veronica on the way out. Everybody have a nice Thanksgiving, and those people that do not have a team, please come down front.